Right, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining me this morning for this Elsewhere webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about the Agentic State, a blueprint for public sector productivity. And over the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, I'm going to share some research that we've conducted over the last few months and pulled into a research report that we published a couple months ago. Before that, a quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be circulated after the session by my colleague Yaffa, along with this deck and the white paper research report that I just mentioned. If you have any issues with that, please also feel free to reach out to me directly. I'll be happy to help anyway. We'll also have time for questions at the end of this, so please feel free to leave them in the comments and I will get to them at the end. Before the good stuff, I'm going to do a quick introduction to myself and Elsewhere. So my name is Gabriel. I am the researcher here at Elsewhere. I have a bunch of experience delivering multi-method research across financial services, the media industry, and the public sector. At Elsewhere, I split my time across our public sector practice, as well as working directly with clients as part of our product team. To introduce Elsewhere, Elsewhere is an AI and digital product consultancy. We help organizations both in the public and private sector become the most effective and productive version of themselves. We've delivered 200 plus client engagements. We now have a team of over 150 people with an average of 12 years of experience across the board. Over the last 15 years or so, we've worked with organizations like Google, Spotify, MasterCard, the National Air Traffic Service, Inmarsat, the European Space Agency, and we work specifically or generally with clients on developing digital products and now AI applications to drive internal productivity and efficiency. In terms of the public sector, we are a government commercial agency supplier. We have places on G Cloud 14, DOS 7, and the AI DPS, and we work in all cloud environments. Excitingly for us at the moment, we were recently announced as one of the Financial Times Europe's 1,000 fastest growing companies for the second year running. So really exciting times here at Elsewhere. But now that's out of the way, we can get back to the fun stuff. And as I said at the start, I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some research we conducted over the last few months. In this report that we launched a couple of months ago, we've distilled roughly 10 hours of interviews from across the public sector, academia, and the public sector supplier ecosystem. And the report documents the opportunities and challenges public sector organizations are facing in unlocking productivity from AI. And in this case, specifically Agentic AI. And we kind of pull all of these findings together into a sort of practical roadmap blueprint for you. So my goal today, fingers crossed, is to give you a practical 20-30 minute version of this report and leave you with some practical takeaways to take back to your organization and team. So to start this, I want to step back and set the scene with a graph for our topic today. So this is a chart from the Office for National Statistics. It tracks productivity across the UK economy since 1997. Pretty simple, but the top line is private sector productivity. The bottom line is public sector. You can see private sector has grown roughly 40% over that time period. The public sector, in contrast, is essentially flat. You know, productivity is barely higher than it was 30 years ago. And I guess the sort of main thing here is that over 30 years, you know, effort invested by the civil service and departments, investment, reform, lots of digital transformation, but the needle on productivity hasn't moved. That's not a criticism of people working in public services. You know, it comes down to structural problems, technological challenges that are unique to government. But it's one challenge that everyone from Treasury officials to frontline civil servants recognizes, and pushing the needle on productivity could have a massive impact. So the question is, what's going to change that trend that we're seeing? The answer offered by economists and researchers like myself is AI. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that effective AI adoption and associated productivity gains could unlock £41 billion in savings across the public sector. And then the Tony Blair Institute there puts the return of investment value at 9x for every pound spent on AI. Those are really compelling numbers. And at Elsewhere, we really do believe that AI represents a critical opportunity for solving the productivity challenge in the public sector. However, we do also believe that the way the public sector is currently approaching AI is not the way to get there. And what we're seeing on the ground is that current experimentation is falling short. We see departments piloting AI generally as generative AI chatbots or co-pilots, summarization assistants, drafting helpers, a lot of tools that you might be using today. But these things make individual tasks faster, but they're focused on individual output or throughput. They're not driving system level performance or citizen outcomes. And you can see this in the reports that are on the slides there. The likes of DWP, DCIT, and DBT, they've all trialed AI pilots, AI tools, but the time use studies behind them tend to show a familiar story. They find real time savings on isolated tasks, things like transcription, note taking, managing calendars, things like this. There's lots of time savings to be had, but ultimately these trials show no meaningful productivity gains overall. And I guess the question is why? Well, at Elsewhere, both in the public and private sector, we see 3 systemic blockers that prevent AI pilots like this from unlocking real productivity gains. The reality is that these sort of tools tend to be piecemeal initiatives. So they're isolated in specific areas and disconnected from strategic direction or measurable outcomes. These tools tend to be generic SaaS off-the-shelf tools that don't fit your specific workflows or integrate with existing systems. And they're often disconnected from data. So we know how important data is for AI, but if your AI can't access internal knowledge, documents, and business context, it can't work effectively. And in our experience working with clients at the moment, it is these systemic blockers that are increasingly making the case for a different type of AI, what we're talking about today, Agentic AI. And Agentic AI is solving many of these blockers at the organizational level, technological level, and as such is becoming a really compelling solution for the public sector as an alternative. And I kind of want to pause here to set up Agentic AI and provide a bit of a definition. So the Government Digital Service defines Agentic AI as AI systems composed of agents that behave and interact autonomously to achieve their objectives. And I think there's a useful definition here, but I want to stress a few other ideas that might help with this definition. Firstly, Agentic AI is powered by LLMs, the same technology that powers generative AI. They operate as autonomous entities or independently. They interact with their environment. They get feedback from these interactions, ultimately to make decisions and achieve goals, that end goal that they're set up for. And in this way, Agentic AI, these unique characteristics of Agentic AI solve those systemic blockers that we were talking about. They're systems that can proactively connect to relevant data. They can adapt and be designed for specific workflows, and they achieve outcomes rather than output or throughput. So weaving this whole kind of 2 or 3 stories that I've spoken about this morning, this paints an interesting picture. On the left there, we have generative AI, the tools that departments are currently piloting. And this operates mostly at the level of employee efficiency, with a bunch of constraints that we documented. And on the right there, you've got agentic AI that, with its unique characteristics, operates at the level of enterprise productivity. It has the ability to fundamentally transform how public sector organizations work end to end, and importantly, reimagine productivity with it. So when we look forward at the challenge facing the public sector and ask, how do we avoid another lost 30 years of productivity? We think there's a genuine window of opportunity here. Agentic AI is maturing fast, the tools exist, the appetite is there, but the question is whether we have the right approach to deploy it effectively. And that's really the core of our research that we conducted. We really wanted to understand what the approach to agentic AI in the public sector should be. And to do this, we went and spoke to the people at the heart of the challenge. So we spoke to those within the public sector, Carl Hoods at ICS Digital. We spoke to those in academia, as well as the supplier ecosystem. And these conversations, interviews, identified 4 key themes for unlocking productivity with agentic AI. These 4 themes were: redefine productivity, to escape the pilot trap, solve for a new data gap, and learn from adjacent industries. And don't worry, I'm going to go through those one by one now. So finding 1, redefine productivity. And this is probably the one theme that surprised us a little bit. It kind of touches on economists and research a little bit more than technology. But one of our interviewees, Nina Jordan, from the University of Cambridge, kind of summed up the productivity definition problem. She says for 40% of public services in the UK, official statistics still assume output equals input, which automatically means 0 productivity growth. So if you think about what that means, for nearly half of public services, the government's own productivity definition or statistics assume that if you spend more, you produce more. There's no actual measurement of what's produced or how well it's produced. It's a very, very simple quantification of productivity. And when it comes to AI, the issue here is that if we don't understand, what we're trying to optimize for, productivity, we can't improve what you don't measure. And right now, we're not really measuring productivity. Our research, although sort of found that productivity could be understood differently in 3 interconnected dimensions. So the first one is budget efficiency. Are we getting value for money? The second is organizational efficiency. Are workflows and processes running effectively? And effectiveness. Are we actually achieving the outcomes that citizens need and want? And it's that last dimension there that I've bolded, because I think this is the really big gap we have at the moment. With effectiveness, we're talking about shifting focus from outputs to outcomes. And with this shift, we can really start thinking about where we can effectively implement AI to make a real impact on citizens. But this is, of course, difficult. When you speak to anyone who talks about productivity, things like citizen outcomes, things like disease prevention, the impact of benefits, these are very hard to measure and quantify with a pound sign. And a lot of work is being done by the ONS, other departments, academia, to develop methodologies for this. And we had an insight into one of those, specifically around the measurement of productivity and what this might look like in an age of AI. So our research highlighted that indicators could be rethought in 4 ways, or measured in 4 ways. Firstly, productivity should be mapped across the full service chain. So we're talking about all the way from budgets to inputs to outputs and outcomes, to really understand what actually happened as a result of work that took place. Secondly, productivity should be adjusted for quality and welfare. So, for example, if an AI processes a benefits claim faster, but gets it wrong more often, that's not productivity. that's waste. AI's contribution needs to be quality adjusted. Thirdly, productivity should be widened to capture organizational learning and agility. Things like digital skills, adaptability, the capacity to improve. These are also leading indicators of sustainable productivity with AI and should be taken into account. And finally, productivity from AI should be grounded in ethics and responsibility. Bias, transparency, explainability, these will all be things that make AI-driven productivity legitimate. So that moves us on to the second finding, where we're talking about escaping the pilot trap. And when we talk about the pilot trap, you might not necessarily know what we're talking about, but I think you've probably all seen this, and we saw it with those reports at the start of this talk. The pilot trap is often where you run a proof of concept or a proof of value, and it often works. It might be a new tool or a new platform, and it works in a controlled setting with synthetic data in a synthetic environment, and the stats are great. The measurements show that this is making a real impact. Everyone's very happy, and then suddenly nothing. It never scales. It never has the bigger impact that we thought it would be, because it was never designed to connect to the real operational challenges that the department faces. And this is kind of summed up by our interviewee, Kat Excel from the Tony Blair Institute, who offers a really nice insight into the pilot trap. The pilot trap is because AI is often treated as an innovation exercise rather than genuine delivery reform. Isolated experiments rarely connect to real operational problems. So the pilot trap is something that is kind of happening with AI as well. Fortunately, there's a bunch of ways that we can escape the pilot trap, and we see three important shifts. The first one is to move from proof of concept to proof of value. So we need to stop testing ideas, stop testing whether AI can do something in a lab, and start proving that it can create measurable impact in real conditions. That's a very different design brief when launching a pilot of any kind. We need to ground experiments in real data and problems. With synthetic inputs, we get synthetic insights. If you're testing with fabricated data, you will not discover edge cases, data quality issues, or real constraints that will kill a project. We need to use real data, real problems from the start. And design for workflows, not tasks. We spoke about the challenge of using AI for isolated tasks that only causes time savings. We want to create end-to-end value, not isolated automation. An agent that automates one step in a 10-step process may save minutes, but might not move the productivity needle. We need to focus on workflows. So halfway through the findings here, the next finding is around a new data gap. And probably, some of you might be thinking, a new data gap, I've not even solved my current data gap. But I think there's more crossover here than you think. And it's this challenge is kind of framed nicely by Carl Hoods at ICS Digital, one of our interviewees. And he talks about the data gap being more about context engineering than prompt engineering, how we build that knowledge context within our domain to be able to access it with agents. I'm going to break this down a bit. So you're probably familiar with the idea of prompt engineering, how to ask AI the right questions and get useful responses. But with agentic AI to work effectively, you need something called context engineering. This is where you curate relevant knowledge context so that agents can work effectively. And this knowledge context or knowledge data often looks like three different things. One, it lives in people's heads. It's the accumulated expertise of experienced civil servants. It lives in documents, presentations, reports, guidance notes scattered across different drives. And it lives in policies. So, formal written rules, procedures, governance documents. Sorry, just got that on the screen there. I think what's quite interesting here is that the public sector has a load of this data. Maybe some of the criticisms of the civil service around bureaucracy and documenting everything actually could be an accelerator here. So the data gap we're talking about here is not having data. The gap is that this knowledge isn't structured or accessible or connected in a way that agents can use it. And in this sense, it's quite similar to current data challenges that we have. And ultimately, there's a bunch of ways you can make this data readable to agents. At Elsewhen, we're working with a lot of clients around the business context layer or knowledge context layer, and happy to share more details around that if people are interested. But ultimately, solving this kind of data challenge is quickly becoming one of the most valuable investments that any organization or department can make as they prepare for implementing and adopting AI. And that last finding, learn from adjacent industries. I think this is probably like the most practical finding that we had from our research. But Carl Hoods, again, gave us a really nice insight into what this actually looks like in the public sector. He takes the leadership team to visit organizations from F1 teams to banks and insurance companies to create connections and share knowledge. That's a really nice kind of spirit that we're talking about here. We're not reinventing the wheel. They're actively seeking out sectors that have dealt with the same tensions or challenges. Many of these have high stakes, heavy regulation, accountability to the public, and they're looking to learn from how they've navigated those challenges. So where else can the public sector look? Banking, insurance mentioned there. There's some really interesting things around how these industries are solving risk management and governance models around AI. Insurance has some really interesting concepts around human oversight in automated underwriting and claims workflows. And then you can look at things like the energy sector. They've been deploying AI at scale across a really critical infrastructure, critical national infrastructure for years and years, an industry that has public accountability and really high safety requirements. And then also telecoms. Telecoms is redesigning customer facing roles around AI agents. If you've spoken to customer service bots, you probably have interacted with an AI agent these days. So the public sector ultimately doesn't need to start from scratch. It can learn and take things from people who have already done this. And so I'm going to kind of bring this all together now and talk about how we brought this together into a blueprint for public sector productivity. And we created a very simple blueprint that has 4 stages. We first talk about map, then build, scale, and finally evolve. And these stages help your organization effectively adopt agentic AI wherever you are in your journey. I don't quite have time today to go into detail on how this can be implemented, but the research report that we've published goes into much deeper detail, includes some case studies, and provides a step-by-step guide to apply the blueprint in your own organization. And in fact, I can share my screen with that now. So if I scroll down past all the content we've just covered, the report itself has a really detailed version of the blueprint that we spoke about and documents each phase of the blueprint with really useful kind of guides as to how you might conduct different activities within each stage. I would encourage you to download the report and have a read. But similarly, if this is something that you would like Elsewhen to come and speak about or help you with more deliberately, then please feel free to get in touch. So kind of coming back to the presentation here, you can download the report using the QR code on the screen here. It will be on the question slide at the end. So if you don't have time right now to scan it, I will come back to it, don't worry. But I'll kind of want to wrap up kind of everything we've heard today. And kind of, if you take away anything from this, kind of let it be this. We think the public sector has a genuine window right now to break the 30-year productivity challenge. Agentic AI is the mechanism, but it will only work if we stop treating AI as an innovation exercise and start treating it as genuine delivery reform. That means redefining productivity, grounding experiments in reality, building the knowledge infrastructure agents need, and learning from those who have done it before. So that's the main content of today. I'll now move on to any questions that people have. Feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll hold off whilst people have any questions. So I've got one here around kind of governance and how the public sector can approach governance. I think that's one of the themes that comes up nicely in the report if you read it. We specifically spoke to Carl Hoods at ICS Digital, and he spoke about not trying to reinvent the wheel with governance. A lot of the governance structures that exist currently around technology and digital in the public sector actually solve for many of the problems that arise from implementing AI and agentic AI. So maybe, first of all, lean on the existing governance that exists. But he did also mention that there's areas that in the public sector specifically we need to solve for. For example, explainability. How do we know and how can we prove the reason why AI made a certain decision that it did? With like the public trust element of the public sector, we have to be really clear about how AI is making decisions. And that's kind of a big governance gap that probably currently exists. Any more questions? I've got one more as well around kind of the public sector workforce. What does that look like in 5 years' time in an AI world? I think it's obviously a very difficult challenge. I think the way the public sector or civil service is going currently is towards fewer people. You see that trend already happening. But I think there's always going to be a place, a majority place for humans in the civil service. There's unique things that humans can do that that AI can't. I think one of the interesting activities that we heard in our research was actually a department going to start to map job descriptions and looking at what exists in job descriptions and looking at what AI might take out and what is remained, and actually starting to build a clearer picture of this AI human model that makes the most of humans and sort of brings unique elements of us as a priority. Right. So I think that's all the questions, unless there's any more. Thank you very much for your time and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.